Hello all, Namaskar. Welcome you back again to another series of AYUDHA. Basically today as we planned we are discussing about the disaster management, which is a topic in the GS3, and in fact it is very one of the most important and very mark fetching what you say a topic in GS3. Basically when we are struggling with the marks in GS3, disaster management comes as a rescue, because tackling economy as such is, I feel, it is a little cumbersome, because you have to memorize a lot of things and a lot of data and all those things. So basically disaster management is a very important issue and important topic that is very much needed to score very high marks in GS3. So now, without wasting a lot of time, let us directly go into the topic disaster management. And what exactly is disaster in the first instance? I'll read you out the definition of disaster as per UNISDR 2016, and we will try to break it up, the definition, and see how can we do brainstorming on any disaster that would be given to us. Basically, let me tell you what all we will discuss today. First, we will see what is a disaster, and can we say every thing that is happening a disaster. Specifically, I mean to say to what all things you can say it is a disaster. Then we will see, is there any basic framework that we can apply to any question on disaster, so that we are, even if we don't know anything, we will be able to write something. Then we will look into some specific best practices, and then we will try to conclude how do we conclude all those things, and if possible we will try to see some of the PYQs. In fact, I will be taking PYQs when we are talking as such. So if you have seen the PYQs, it is nowadays asking more on vulnerability. So we will come to that at the very first instance. But let us first see what is the definition of disaster. So as per UNISDR 2016, according to UN, the disaster is a serious disruption of the functioning of the society. This is one part. There is a disruption in the functioning of the society. That means the society cannot function in its normal form. Then what is the next part? It says, which involves widespread what? Human, material, economic or environmental losses and impacts. So now first is, it is disrupting the society. Number two, it is affecting a lot of things, like the human impact is there is environmental impact, there is economic impact. And what is the third part? Which exceeds the ability of the affected society to cope using its own resources. So here we got three parts. The disaster is something which is disrupting the normal functioning of the society, which affects the economic, human and environmental aspect of the society. And this is something that the society cannot cope up with, cannot manage it with the given resources. So now we are clear with the term disaster. Now there is another alternative way also to define disaster. So I want you to remember basically three terms. Number one, hazard. Number two, vulnerability. Number three, capacity. So after discussing this, I will ask you again that everything that is happening, is it a disaster or not, and you will be satisfactorily able to answer. Now what is hazard? Hazard is something which is happening, the natural things like earthquake or a natural threat or a flood. This is not disaster, this is natural hazard. Hazard is something which is very immediate and unprecedented effect that is happening and which has a lot of effect on our life. Now what is vulnerability? Vulnerability, that means what is your position and how much affected will you be happening by this hazard. For example, there is a volcano behind my house. If this volcano is erupts, then I am in a very high vulnerable position because I am nearer to the volcano. So this is vulnerability. The number three thing that I said is capacity. Do I have the capacity to deal with the volcano? Assume I have a helicopter with me, and the moment the volcano starts, if I am able to flee, then I have the capacity to deal with the volcano. So everything that is happening, like a volcanic eruption, like a flood, like a landslide, they are all natural hazard. So what makes them disaster? So when this hazard leads to loss of man and material, involving economic and environmental losses, then only it is a disaster which we cannot handle with our own capacity. For example, if an earthquake happens in Mars, it is not a disaster because there is no man and material losses. It is only a hazard. Assume if an earthquake happens in the very remote area of Thar Desert or Sahara Desert, where there are no human habitations, then the earthquake is not a disaster. It is just a hazard. So that takes us to our definition. One thing is that what happens is mostly hazard. So disasters are mostly man-made and hazards are natural. So this is the very fundamental thing that I wanted to make you understand. So now when you see earthquake or volcanic eruption or something, you will not say it as disaster, because until unless it affects the human being, it disrupts the society, and it is beyond our capacity to cope with it, it is not a disaster. I'll give you another example. For example, in Japan, we know Japan is very prone to earthquake. But can you say every earthquake that is happening in Japan is a disaster? The answer is no. Because they have developed the technique to deal with the earthquakes, due to which there is minimal loss of man and material. There is minimum loss of life and property. So it is a natural hazard, but it is not becoming disaster. Why? Because the people there are not vulnerable. The people there have the capacity to deal with it. So what makes a disaster? We come to our second definition. If I give you a form of mathematical formula, and this is something that you must write on your answers in disaster management, because this is something that will make the examiner very impressed on you. Now write disaster is equal to hazard multiplied by vulnerability divided by capacity to cope with it. Are you able to understand? Because disaster is directly proportional to the hazard. Disaster is directly proportional. The more the hazard, the more it is disastrous. The more the people are vulnerable, the more it is disastrous. However, if the people have more capacity, then they are less disastrous. So that's why the capacity to deal with it is put on the denominator, on the lower side. So disaster is equal to hazard multiplied by vulnerability whole divided by capacity to deal with it. And what is risk? Risk is hazard multiplied by vulnerability. So disaster is something, risk divided by the capacity to cope with it. There are many multiple interpretations you will see. This is one of the interpretations. In fact, many say it is said by ARC as such. So second ARC. So I feel now you are clear. Now UPSC has asked in the previous year questions that how do you reduce the vulnerabilities of the people and all those things, so that you can make them more disaster aware and all those things. So now when you are aware that what is vulnerability, then you can deal with them more efficiently. Now I will explore another way of vulnerability, another broad aspect of vulnerability. Whom do we call vulnerable sections in our GS paper 1? We say it to women, we say it to transgenders, we say it to old age people, we say it to disabled people, we say it to very backward people, backward class people whom we consider as Dalits and all those things. Why? Because they don't have the enough economic means to carry out their life very properly or very independently. Although they are very much abused, discriminated and all those things. So I will tell you one very instance that happens in most of the disaster, and I feel if you remember this story, you will be able to bring the compassionate angle in the disaster. Because the moment you bring the compassionate angle in your disaster answer, you are going to get good marks. Because it shows your quality as a civil servant. There were many cases where the floods happen. You know where the floods happen. And in that what happens? Man mostly they evacuate. Who are left? The women. And you must be knowing that there is a feminization of aging. The men die early, the females die a bit later. This is proven by fact. So mostly the women who are there in the flood prone areas, many of them are very old age women, and no one is there to take them with them. So what happens? Ultimately, many of the women die in the floods and all those things. You will see the reports and all those things. You will find a lot of women die. And what happens in a flood? They are swept away with the water flow. For example, if the woman is in point A, she is swept away in the flood and she reaches point B, and she has already died, or she is in the half life condition. What happens? The man, not the man. It is very bad to say man. It is something like in the locals in the position B, those who are not of very good character, they try to snatch the golden ornaments or anything that they have worn in their ears, necks, and their nose and all, not trying to help them. This makes the woman also very vulnerable to disaster. So that's why assume the case of a disabled person. If a disabled person is there and suddenly a flood comes, will he be able to evacuate? So this is something that is vulnerability is there. So while you are writing what can be the types of vulnerability, and this is something that is very important we are going to discuss because UPSC asked a direct question on it. Number one can be the economic vulnerability. If I don't have the enough means to evacuate the area, for example, a volcanic eruption happens, if I don't have a car, if I'm going by walking, then there is a high chance that I will die. If there is a tsunami, for example, I don't have a car or helicopter or something, then I'm going to die. This is economic vulnerability when you don't have the economic means to migrate from that area, to deal with that thing. For example, if a flood happens and I have nothing to eat with me, I have no money to store food with me, I am in economic vulnerability. There is another that is the social vulnerability. That is the elderly, the transgenders, the disabled. They are all the socially vulnerable. There is another thing that is physical vulnerability. For example, the Himalayas, the Western Ghats, they are very prone to landslides. The Ganges belt, the Indus belt, the belt of Mahanadi and all, the area there is very vulnerable to floods. You cannot do anything about that. This is physical vulnerability. There is another that is the environmental vulnerability, like the saltwater intrusion and agri runoff and all those things. And there is also attitudinal vulnerability. For example, when we don't want to take our preventive measures, we think that the earthquake will never happen. Why to make all these earthquake prone buildings, earthquake proof buildings, because it will take a huge amount of money. Let us live like that. This is our attitude, and by this attitude we are making ourselves vulnerable to disaster. So now I feel you can able to answer any question on vulnerability. Why? Because vulnerability is one of the important fact that is making a hazard into disaster. Are you able to get me? Are you able to get me? You can write the comment as well, because it will help me to know whether are you getting it or not. And there are different types of vulnerability that we have discussed. So this is something that I wanted to discuss, the very basics of the the very basics of the thank you. Okay, the very basics of the disaster. So all these things. Now let us go. Is there any framework in which we can address any question of the disaster? Let me quote a SDG over here. Can we put a SDG in disaster? Definitely yes. Which one? You can put SDG 9, although not directly related, but you can put, I am trying to open up your mind. You must try to think how can you relate the SDGs. What is SDG 9? Industry, innovation and infrastructure. For example, on any question on earthquake, are we making our, buildings earthquake prone? Is my infrastructure very resilient enough? So SDG 9 says us to make our infrastructure very resilient. So it is there where we are going to make all those things. So this is something that SDG you can put. Now let us go to other aspects of disaster. So what are another thing that you must know is that what are the different steps of disaster management that is there, because we know NDMA Act is there 2005, which comprehensively deals with the disaster. But now again I will ask you, is disaster management there in any of the list? Is there it is in union list or state list or concurrent list? The answer is no. It is not mentioned in any of the list. So with whom the most the power comes? It is with the center. Why? Because of the residuary power. Now let us come to NDMA 2005. So it was mostly formed as an immediate measure after the 2004 tsunami and our sheer loss that we suffered and all those things. So what happened? So in NDMA there is a three-triad structure. There is a central structure, that is NDMA, which is handled by chaired by the Prime Minister. Then we have SDMA, which is chaired by the Chief Minister, and we have DDMA, that is the district level disaster management authority, which is handled by the district collector. There is also, we have formed NDRF and SDRF, National Disaster Response Force. You must be hearing the name very repeatedly wherever a disaster happens, because they are the first ones to go to the site of disaster and rescue the people. So now that we have discussed what is the structure, and in fact there is another National Institute of Disaster Management, and there are a lot of journal things which are also there. You can refer to that, just because I am just telling you what all you need to study. So now let us see how can we handle any type of disaster. Now that we have known that for any disaster there are three components that are there. Number one is there must be a hazard. Number two thing, there must be a vulnerability of the people. And number three thing, that those vulnerable people don't have the capacity to deal with it. Now let us try to discuss different disasters and can we find some of the means. For example, let us take earthquake. And before that, I will try to tell you some of the very easier facts to remember. There is a global climate risk index that is generated every year. In 2019, India was the fifth most vulnerable. It changes every year. You can check that and you can put that. 60%, almost 57% to 60% of our land mass is prone to earthquake. Can you imagine? Delhi is in zone 4 if I am not wrong. So this is something that is very, that 38 cities lies in high seismic risk zone. Around 12% of our land mass are prone to flood, which is around 40 million hectares of land. So this shows how prone we are to disasters. And here we are taking the opportunity to discuss different disasters as well. There is 68% of cultivable area which is prone to drought. And this describes why the farmers are doing suicides and all those things. Why the farmers need the remunerative means. And again, I will ask you to link disaster with the climate change. And this is in fact, when we will go to Sendai Framework, we will see that this is the primary thing. And in fact, in 2020, UPSC asked, how do we have changed our disaster management from a reactive approach to a more risk reduction approach? This is what we will discuss. Then there is another stat that 76%, almost more than three-fourths of our coastline is 7516 kilometers, 7500 kilometer coastline, which includes the coastal area, the coast of Andaman Nicobar, if I am not wrong, and Lakshadweep as well, is prone to tsunami. More than three-fourths of our coastline is prone to tsunami. 12.6% of our land, excluding the snow-covered land, are prone to landslide. And landslide was a question that was asked twice in the 2021 UPSC, once in GS1 and once in GS3. So you can imagine, remembering also one of these stats will help you very highly. And in your exam, as per UNISDR, India has been ranked as the world's most disaster-prone country for displacement of residents. Why? Due to climate change and all this disaster thing. So 85% of area of India is vulnerable to single or multiple disasters. This is something that you must know, because this is something that is very disastrous, because 85% of our land is prone to some of the disasters, some of the vulnerabilities. And as per another UN report, 40 million people will be at risk from rising sea level by 2050. So these are some of the facts that I wanted to tell you. Now let us go to some of the disasters and how do we write it in our answers. There are 2 to 3 types of questions that are asked in UPSC. Let us see how do we answer single questions on disasters as well. For example, there is a question on earthquake. I am just taking one disaster. I am trying to brainstorm. You will do it for all other disasters and you will get ample material in various coaching institutes which you can write. What is earthquake? Define the shaking of the earth and all those things. This is a very normal definition. Apart from that, what you can do, you make a small diagram and say, sir, this is the thing, and here there is a fault line, and this is the epicenter, this is the focus, and all those things, and this is how the P and S waves transmit. This is something that is very common in geography, and we can do that. Apart from that, you can make another map of India, and you can show which all areas are earthquake prone. The Himalayan area is earthquake prone. You can say now the Koyna Dam, the Bhima fault line is happening in the Deccan Plateau. This is also earthquake prone. And some of the areas of the northeast India are also earthquake prone. And you will find these maps all over there. Now, after that, how do we write the question on earthquake? If a question comes on earthquake, and how do you deal with it? First, mention what is earthquake. Then write the fact that around 57% of Indian landmass is prone to earthquake. And after that, we have drawn a small diagram and a map as well. And now it is asked, how do you deal with it? So for every disaster, there are 3 steps that we have to do. One is pre-disaster, one is during the disaster, one is the post-disaster. And for each of the disaster, like earthquake, flood, tsunami, industry, man-made, and all of these things, you will find some of these things will stay as it is, and there will be some points that will be unique for each of the disasters. So now for earthquake, let us discuss what are the causes of earthquake. It can be due to tectonic activities. It can be due to the reservoirs, the dams. We have seen the Koyna Dam crashing. It is due to the collapsing of the mining roof areas and all those things. There are a number of things which are leading to earthquake. Now let us see what we can do. So the pre-disaster thing, what we can do, we have to do vulnerability mapping. These keywords are very important. We have to do vulnerability mapping. We should have early dissemination system. We should plan our evacuation routes from where area. See, this is the thing that will be common in each of the things. Like for flood also, you have to plan the evacuation route. You have to make an atlas. You have to make a vulnerability mapping. You need to do early dissemination system. For example, if a flood is going to happen, if you are in the upstream, you will tell it to the downstream people that a flood is approaching. You please flee from the area. So these are something you have to do pre-disaster. Now here one word comes, that is mitigation. There is something like preparedness and mitigation. What is mitigation? Mitigation means preparing yourself very efficiently so that the risk that is involved will be very less. For example, for earthquake as such, making a building that is earthquake proof, that they use the term seismic isolation, is mitigation, because here you are making the building, you are not throwing away the building, or you are not taking away or demolishing the building, but you are making it adapt to earthquake so that the risk will be very minimum. So this is something is mitigation. This is something you are well prepared from the from the very beginning, and you are reducing the risk of the disaster. So in the pre-disaster time, you have to plan all these mitigative measures. And for mitigation, again there are two dimensions, and this is also you can use in every disaster. One is structural, another is non-structural. So what is structural? Which needs some engineering interference. Like for example, if you are making again earthquake, take the example of earthquake. If you are making a building, structural thing means you are following the earthquake code, building code that is earthquake resistant. You are doing seismic isolation and all those things. This is the structural thing, because you are changing with the structure of the building. What is the non-structural thing? It is the early dissemination system. It is the risk mapping. It is the vulnerability mapping. It is something that is non-structural. And in both the ways, we are trying to reduce the risk that is associated once the earthquake happens. So now you got the meaning. Now what you will do during the disaster? Please be connected to the radio and TV. What is there? This is something that you will put in everywhere. For earthquake, there are some specific, like fold yourself and go inside a very stable area like a bed or something else, so that if any debris forms and all those things. So these are something that you will find very unique. Like for flood, for example, if you will discuss the thing what you should do during the flood, you should not touch any water bodies, because you should not plug in anything, because if there is anything that is plugged in, you must take it out, because if it will be connected with the water, then there will be electrocution and all those things. So these are something, there are uniqueness, and you will find it for any disaster. Now what you will do post disaster? For here also there is one standard procedure, you can follow that. The number one, search and evacuation must be done. This is very important, search and evacuation of the people. Then what happens? You have to do reconstruction, rehabilitation, rebuilding of all those things. And this is something, again one thing that you can write, that the persons who are affected, they must be given rehabilitation. You should not limit yourself only to economic rehabilitation or shelter rehabilitation, but it includes psychological rehabilitation. They must be given psychological counseling. Assume there is an earthquake and I lose my father and mother, my sister, my family and my everything, then I will not be in a mental state to continue my living. So what you will give me back then? You will give me psychological counseling. And this is something that will give you 0.5 mark extra, because many of the students don't write this. And this is where they lack it. So this is something that you must write. Psychological counseling, psychological rehabilitation. Please note it down. Please write it in all your answers on disaster. And this is build back better. Something that is there. And all this process, like what you should do before disaster, during disaster, and post disaster, it is there in NDMA guidelines. So in UPSC, they can ask you what you must do during the disaster. And they can also ask what are the NDMA guidelines during all those things. And we know that whatever things we have discussed, they must be there in the NDMA guidelines, because I am not telling anything from the mind. Rather, I am telling you something that I have read in many newspapers. And everyone follows the NDMA guidelines. So don't get confused. Even if you are writing these steps, you can also write that according to NDMA guidelines, there must be this thing, that thing, and all those things. And you will find very ample examples for that. I feel now we are more or less clear about all those things. If I am not wrong. So we have discussed that the impact of disaster is on the people, property and environment, and you can make a diagram on that. So now we will say what are all the very common points that you can write. How do you prepare people for disaster management? And these are very common points which you can use in disaster management, and as well as other answers. Please take a note of that. Something I am telling you, okay? One is spreading awareness. sensitization and training both. What is awareness? You will tell them that during disaster, don't do this, don't do that, and all those things. And you can also train them to be the volunteer, to be the evacuator, to be the first response force, because the time NDRF and SDRF will come, it might take 1 or 2 hours. And we know that there is a principle of golden hour. There is high chance that the person will be saved if we give him proper medical treatment within 1 hour. This is applicable in road accidents as well. That's why we have the Good Samaritan law. So why don't you make them volunteer? So this is awareness, spread awareness. Then there is another thing, vulnerability mapping, susceptibility zonation. These are very good terms. Please write them before the disaster. Susceptibility zonation and all those things. Yes, Apada Mitra scheme is there. We will discuss that. In fact, there are many government schemes which are there. Apada Mitra scheme has got the limelight. You can write that. There is also early dissemination system. This is applicable for tsunami. This is applicable for flood. This is applicable for earthquake. This is applicable for anything. You can write that. Are you able to get me what I am trying to say? Then there is another, that is planning. And here comes the very important keyword which there must be there in your answer. And I want you to write this in your answer. That is CBDM, Community Based Disaster Management. Why this term is very important? See, for example, if you want to make anything sustainable, if you want to make anything that people will follow them without even the law, then it must be inclusive and participatory. For example, I will give you an example. If you want making this helmet thing compulsory, we are trying to do it by law, by these fines and all those things. But there will be a time when we cannot enforce the fines. In fact, we see every day, many people don't wear helmet, they roam and they don't get fine. This is there. So this practice is not unsustainable, because the moment you remove the law, people will go back to their thing and they will not wear helmet. But for example, multi-hazard mapping framework and enforce it resilient. Yes, definitely. This is there. That's what I was trying. There is multi-hazard resilience you must do with all those things, and you can write. Definitely, that is fine. So now coming back to our point. So for everything to make sustainable, the people must accept it. For example, one thing is the Swachh Bharat Abhiyan. Although there are many people who don't follow it, but you must have seen a lot of change in the attitude of the people have come. And many are not throwing even the gutka packet or the cigarette packet now on the road. They are searching for a dustbin. And you cannot put a fine on them if you will throw. There are provisions of fine, but who enforces them? We know. But basically, because out of their change, they are searching for a dustbin and they are putting their individual effort. Why? Because this approach has been sustainable. This approach has been inclusive. This approach has been participatory. And here comes the role of CBDM, Community-Based Disaster Management. We must train people. We must involve people from the local areas while planning a disaster management. While planning an evacuation plan or while planning anything regarding to disaster, we must involve the local people, the Gram Panchayat, the society area. There was an earthquake that happened in Japan somewhere back in 1990s or 80s. And 85% of the people were rescued by their neighbors and all those people. So see the beauty of the community-based disaster management, because they know the area, they know the in and out of the area, they know when to go, where to go, how to go. So this is something, that's why a grassroots participation of the people in the disaster management planning will help a lot. And that's why I want you to include this CBDM, Community-Based Disaster Management word in your answer, because it will give a very good feeling to the examiner and you will get some good marks. Why? Because as a civil servant, you must be team player. You must be something who is not hungry for power, rather he wants to make people empowered. And this step of yours shows that you are making the people empowered. So that's why it is very important. Now there are evacuation plans that we will discuss. There is another thing, that is 3A, alert, awake and active. And this is something that is also very important. You must make the people alert, they must be active, and they must be awake when the disaster comes. And there are anything, in fact, in the lower level also, in the family level also, you can plan some family disaster management plans. So this is something that is very important and that we must do. Now let us come to, we will go later to best practices. Now let us discuss the Sendai Framework. In fact, before Sendai Framework, there was Hugo Framework, and now we have the Sendai Framework, which, if I am not wrong, is from 2015 to 2030, and it deals with how do we deal with disaster. And it has 4 components to it. I'll read it out to you. Just a minute. Give me a second. Yes. So Sendai Framework 2015 to 2030, what are the priorities? Understanding the disaster risk. This is something like disaster preparedness. This is the pre-disaster thing. This is the mitigation thing. Now, strengthening the disaster risk governance to yes, strengthening the disaster risk governance to manage disaster risk. Again, this is empowering the people, and we are planning beforehand how do we handle the things once a disaster happens. The third thing is investing in disaster risk reduction for resilience. Here, the word resilience is very important. Risk reduction is there. How? What? For what? It is for resilience. What is resilience? It is the ability of the people to cope up with the disaster or anything that is unpredictable. And the fourth thing is enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response. When you will give response once the disaster has happened, and to build back better. This is the term, build back better. You must remember this term, build back better, because anytime you are writing about Sendai Framework or anything, you must write in the post disaster that build back better mechanism should be there. For what? In recovery. What is recovery? Recovering the people, recovering the economic means and all those things. Rehabilitation. And again, I have said, apart from the social and economic and all those rehabilitation, please mention psychological rehabilitation, and this is very important. And reconstruction. Reconstruction of what? All the damaged things. So this is something that is very important for Sendai Framework. And in fact, our National Disaster Management Plan is in line with Sendai Framework. And this is something very important. And this is how earlier in the disaster management, our approach was mostly reactive. Once a disaster happens, how we will evacuate people, how we will take them out, how we will make them reach the hospital, how we will do all these things. This was our approach. But now what we are doing, we are more into reducing the risk. And what is the risk? We have discussed vulnerability into hazard. We are trying to reduce the risk. Disasters will happen. Hazards will happen. You cannot control that. But we can reduce the risk. This is in our hand. How do you reduce the risk? By discussing all these things. We have discussed that awareness, disaster resilient buildings and all those things. Someone wrote in Indonesia, the games that are given to the children, and they have all this disaster. How do you deal with the disaster? And this is very important. You are sensitizing the children. And this is the best practice also that is there. So I feel now you are able to relate how do we handle all the disaster. And there is one thing that I will say, this is another salt point. Why I say it's salt point? Salt points are the points that you can use in most of the disaster. This is all about the natural disasters. I am telling you a salt point about the man-made disasters. Like for example, a biological attack, a industrial attack, or something. Biological attack means like someone has released the virus, biological warfare. Industrial disaster, that means release of the gas. We had seen in Visakhapatnam the styrene foam was released and a lot of people were all those things. We have the Bhopal gas tragedy. So there are many industrial risks, the chemical warfare. So in all of them, one of the causes you can write is the terrorist attack. In all of the industrial thing, you can write like the nuclear disaster, the radiation disaster. This is the salt point. You can use terrorist attack for in every man-made disaster. So because everyone has their own thing. Like for the industrial disaster, there might be the regulation is not there, the machines that are used are not up to the mark, there is no regular auditing, the manpower is not skilled. So all these things are there. But apart from that, you can write terrorist attack because it will add a dimension. Now let us discuss some of the best practices for different disasters, and it will help you, because I feel that by discussing that way, we are more clear how can we deal with every disaster. And in fact, these are the only things that you need to remember. Don't try to remember a lot of things. Again, our code word is Sarvanasam Samutpanne Ardham Tyajati Panditaha. You have to write maximum 3 pages, not more than that. Remembering a lot of things about a single topic will not help you a lot. Rather, try to diversify yourself and do. And in fact, in Sendai Framework, what you have discussed, if I'll add your point, you must take care of the climate change aspect. Now, the disaster management should also take care of the climate change aspect, because climate change is a burning topic and it is there. So, okay. So now let us discuss some of the best practices. I'm trying to go there. Yes. In fact, I'll say you one thing. You must be aware of the Chenab bridge that is happening. That is the highest railway bridge. You can search about that. It can withstand earthquake forces of highest intensity zone 5. This is something you can write. Wherever you are writing earthquake prone building or infrastructure or all that, you can give the example of Chenab bridge. While I was working, there is another thing that I will say you. While I was working with, you must be knowing, I was there with companies before that. I was working before coming into this line. So what happens during while I was working in a company, I came to know that in history, in past, something had happened, like one of the supplier had a plant which was in the low lying area, and flood happened, and they had to stop the production for some days or all these things. After that, what happened? They did regular audit that even if a flood happens, how they will prevent it. So these are something, the corporate measures that have been taken by a lot of companies to reduce the disaster risk. This also you can mention in your example. What they say is flood mapping, and they do all these things. Now again, there is another important fact that I will say, that according to Sendai Framework, every $1 spent on disaster risk reduction leads to gain of $7. That means if I'll spend $1 on making the building earthquake resistant, I will have the gain of $7 when if the earthquake happens and the building collapses. Because it is good to invest earlier, but why we don't invest? We know every funda that you spend $1 now, and if a disaster happens, the building will not collapse, and you will have a gain of $7, and you will not have the expenditure of recovering all the people and all those. There are a lot of things that happen once a disaster happens. You have to give them food, shelter, and all those things. Why we don't do? Because we are a developing country. For example, we know that around 22% of our people, as per census 2011, are below poverty line. We are all aware of that. So can we have the liberty that we will make all our building into earthquake prone building, because it is a costly affair? So the developing countries are mostly confused where to spend the money, whether they will spend it on economic growth, on the welfare policies, or on making the building disaster resilient. So that is the reason why most of the developing countries don't invest heavily on making the buildings disaster risk reduced. Rather, they are mostly into economic activities, and they only feel the pain once some disaster happens, and they are into all those things. So this is something. Now again, with respect to disaster, second ARC says the majority of the responsibility should be there with the state, and the center should only support. There should not be any centralization. That must be there with the state. Now I will say some of the very important best practices. For example, with respect to cyclone and all those things, Japan has coastal forest as an effective barrier. You can write that in the best practices. So you can say that just like Japan has coastal barriers, so coastal forest is effective barrier, we can also do that. Something like that. For example, you can also quote the example of Odisha, because Odisha has emerged as the undoubtable leader in management of cyclone. They have the policy of zero casualty, and they are doing fabulously on that. How do they do it? There is the inter-agency coordination. They are the NDRF and SDRF are doing early dissemination system, faster resource mobilization, and effective planning. These are all the reasons why Odisha has emerged as the undoubtable leader in management of cyclone, and you can quote the example of Odisha without any doubt, and that will help a lot. Now there are, with respect to flood, with respect to tsunami also, there is one thing like I don't know to close them. Yes. Like tsunami also, there are Indian tsunami early warning system that is there. All hands on the deck is the principle of Odisha disaster management. Yes, definitely, all hands on the deck. It implies that all of the government services. In fact, you would be knowing that when a cyclone happens in Odisha or something, the first thing that any district administration do, they cancel all the holidays. They cancel all the leaves that have been taken by all the employees. All hands on the deck. Someone is written. That is very true. In fact, so there is another thing like tsunami. You must be writing about Indian Tsunami Early Warning Center Sagar Vani app. This is very important. Inquiries under MOES, Ministry of Earth Science. With respect to flood, best practices, Odisha, again I will quote the example, Flood Hazard Atlas in Odisha. This is one of the very novel things that they have done. They have mapped the flood areas, and they have mapped that in which area and which time there is a high risk of flood, how much flood is happening, what is the recurrency rate of flood, after how many years the flood is of very high impact, and how it is related to the monsoon. This is very important, and you can write that. In fact, you can mention it for any question on disaster risk management. You can write that. Then another best practice is Tokyo. Tokyo has underground reserve complex to store excess rainwater runoff in case of catastrophic flooding. Because you must have seen in urban flooding, what is the issue? In urban flooding, the most of the issue The urban flooding, the most of the issue is with what you say. There are littering. You litter a lot of polythene and all those things. You what you say. You fill all the natural reservoirs like the lake, because what happens in the rainy season, a lot of water falls by rains. What happens then? If the area is very well developed, well natural, they will go to the nearby lake, because which is a downward area, which is like in the form of depression, and they will get stored there. But assume you have filled it up and you have made a building over it, where the area where all the rainwater will go, they will not go anywhere. And what? You have choked all the drainage system by throwing all the polythenes and all those things. And they are like flooding the whole of the area. So what Tokyo has done, they have made underground excess floodwater reserves. Like when the rainwater will fall, they will underground store, they will there in the underground reserves, and once the rain is stopped, they will automatically discharge. This is one of the best practices. In fact, South Asian flash flood guidance system has been developed by IMD. This is again one of the best practices, you can say. Okay. Now again, there is also floodway in Manila, Philippines. You can also check about that. So this is something. Now there is also sponge pavement in China, sponge city concept in China, which I had also given in my channel also some days back by describing it with a diagram. You can also write that in case of flood. Now with respect to earthquake, I will tell you, India Quake app has been developed by MOEs. India Quake app. This is very relevant. Please write it that it is something like early dissemination system and a lot of other facilities also, which will help you a lot. Then there are some indigenous things that are indigenous building structures that are very helpful in earthquake. Like one is Dhaji Devari system, and there is Bhongo or something that they say. Dhaji Devari system in Kashmir mostly, because that you must be knowing that Himalaya is very prone to earthquakes. So that is there. There are quake proof technologies, that is the jacket method. Please write the word jacket method in bridges, and seismic isolation at homes. Then there is another thing, urgent earthquake detection and alarm system to shut off electricity in Japan. Because basically what happens when the earthquake happens, the electric poles fall down, and if there is any water on the road, the whole road gets electrified, and anyone who steps on that dies. So in Japan, there is something like earthquake detection and alarm system to shut off the electricity. Then there is also demonstration of earthquake resistant construction in annual fair in agriculture fair in Satara and Maharashtra. These are all sharing the best practices. So these are something which we can say with respect to best practices with respect to earthquake. Now with respect to landslide, USA uses LIDAR technology to prevent landslides by getting insights into geographical risk zones and helps in identifying landslide prone zones. Because I had used this example in both the answers of GS1 and GS3 on the landslide that has been asked on 2021. USA uses the LIDAR technology. You must be knowing LIDAR is light thing, light detection, that thing. The radar is radio waves, LIDAR is light. And what happens by using the LIDAR thing, they are able to map the area. And if they find that this is the area where the landslide is going to happen, they make all those retaining walls which will help prevent it. They make future arrangements which will help prevent it. And that is how they control the LIDAR thing, this thing. Okay. So around 30% of world's landslides happen in India. And economic loss due to landslides is 1 to 2% of GNP in many developing countries. See the impact and all those things. So that's it. See, again, for nuclear disaster, there is one thing. In USA, each commercial nuclear plant has on-site and off-site emergency plan to protect public in case of radiological emergency. This is something we have seen that in Fukushima nuclear plant, and this thing, a lot of caution has been raised. So USA is something that will help in public protection, and this is something that is there. So and another thing, like for example, if there is any nuclear radiation, in chemical radiation, in biological warfare, one thing you can write that please cover all the food and water items and all those things, because they will also get affected, and this is which is there. So in fact, I feel that I have discussed more or less about the best practices as well. We have discussed about the Sendai approach. We have discussed how it is now no more a reactive approach, rather something that is very important. Now with respect to another thing, there is an important word that is called impact-based forecasting. I want you to write the word impact-based forecasting rather than writing the only forecasting of the disaster, because impact-based forecasting is a much more beautiful word, which is more outcome oriented, and that will help you in making your answers more objective and fetching good marks. Like, so all these things are there. For example, if you get, like, there might be urban disasters like fire, like urban flooding. We know a lot of things, like there might be some epidemic, like this in the slum areas. There might be some rabies spreading or anything, the plague, the cholera. So for everything you must approach all these things with all these things, like the awareness, sensitization, planning, and all those things, vulnerability mapping, susceptibility mapping. So this is something, but urban thing requires something extra, and that is what we need to see. Because why? Like, we must have seen the fire in Delhi Munirka area, which claimed so many lives. What is the main reason for the urban thing? Congestion. The government must do something to reduce the congestion. There are two congestions. One is the settlement congestion, another is the traffic congestion. For example, if a disaster happens, for example, there is a big fire in my area and I want to get out of that. What will happen? After going 100 meters, there is a traffic jam. All of the people there will die. The fire will spread. So this is something. Due to the congestion of the shelter, people will die, and you cannot move out of that area because of the traffic congestion. So please be aware. There are also NDMA guidelines with respect to how you will handle the stampede, crowd management. You can refer to them. Take 1 or 2 good points, 4 or 5 good points, and in your answers, please write there is also NDMA guidelines and all those things. And this will help you write some good answers, and indirectly it will help you a lot in making your answers very differentiated ones. And there is another thing, that is the 3C, that is capacity, coordination, and community participation. We know that we have to increase the capacity of the people to handle that. How you will increase the capacity of the people? By doing structural and non-structural mitigative principles. There is another thing, that is the coordination. Coordination among whom? Among various stakeholders, the public, the private, the government agencies. Like, for example, the cyclone happens. How is Odisha able to save so many people? There is a coordination. Between whom? I am telling you, all the stakeholders. Please try to think. There is one IMD who says, Indian Meteorological Department, who predicts that when the cyclone will flow, at what time it will do landfall. There is one thing. The state government coordinates with IMD. Then again, within the state governments, who all are the stakeholders? Number one, there is SDRF, State Disaster Response Force. There is also NDRF, they coordinate. The Home Department and all the district, they coordinate with each other. Then there is a team that evacuates the people from all the coastal areas. They are taken to another shelter. There is one team. There is another team which makes arrangement of food and medicine. Please remember the term. When you are evacuating the people, you are taking them to a shelter, a cyclone shelter or something. The work will not happen only if you give the food. They need medicine also. They need some emergency medical treatment also. Doctor must also be available. For example, there is an impending pregnancy that needs urgent delivery. What you will do? So there must be some doctor who will be able to do the procedures. So this is something. And the third is community participation, which I have already discussed, CBDM, and it is my request to you again with folded hands. Please write it in your answer. It will help you get good marks. So then there is another one diagram that I want you to do in your answers, and this is mostly the last thing that I will say. Imagine this is x-axis, this is y-axis. This is y-axis, this is x-axis. Please draw a diagram. Just imagine my hand. This is the origin, okay? You draw one straight line over here, and then from one point of that, please draw a line like this. There must be one U, and there is one line which is going tangentially upward. You write on the y-axis environmental degradation, and here on the top line you say without disaster reduction policies or disaster reduction infrastructure and all those things, and in the line which goes down you write with disaster risk reduction and all those things, because it means to say that without disaster risk reduction, the destruction, the loss of the property and the man's life is on higher line. And if you are able to do the disaster risk reduction, it diminishes with time. So this is something that I wanted to discuss with you. I hope you got a thing that how you can think of anything. Because basically, again, for a disaster that you get, any question on disaster, please try to think. For example, if I take another question on disaster, like for example, let us take on the flood. First define what is flood. Then say this much area is under flood. Then do a diagram in India, what are all the floods, what all areas are there in the flood. Then see how many types of floods are there. There might be some seasonal flood, there might be some another flood. There are all the dimensions in this thing. Then you can this is something that you can say, you can also say that how do the floods happen. It might be due to the failure of dam, it might be due to overrain, it might be due to cloud burst, it might be due to n number of factors. This is the impact. Then how do you prevent the people, you cannot prevent flood, but you can reduce the disasters intensity. How do you do? Please think on these lines. What risk, how the hazard, and how can you take care of the hazard. Hazard is going to happen, but how can you take care of the early dissemination system and all those things. Then again the people, and also the people's capacity to do with it and their vulnerabilities. Please try to think on all these lines. Then try to see what you will do during the disaster, before the disaster, and after the disaster. You will get a very good diagram. Search in the internet, you will get a very good diagram. The steps during disaster, you will see the disaster, prepare, mitigate, response, and all those things. That is a diagram that is there. Please find that on your internet, you will find. Please think on those lines. Then write some best practices and then conclude. And you can put some SDGs. How will you conclude? Conclude, say that this is the scheme, this is the thing that that will help India to cope up with the disaster, because we are going into so many loss, and if we reduce this loss, then we'll get so much of benefit and all those things. And in all these lines, you can conclude, you can in fact quote. There is another thing that I want to say, CDRI, Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure. This has been initiated by our own Prime Minister. So this is very important. Please quote it wherever you can, and you can use Sendai Framework. Traditional knowledge, yes, definitely, that's what I say. Traditional knowledge, the Dhaji Devari system, the Johars, the Khadins, they are for rainwater storage and all those things. You can please use traditional things. And at the end, you can use some SDGs and all those things, where all you can write all these things, and you can conclude. There is also PM's 10-point program to how to deal with disaster. Can we say cultural pollution? See, again, if you want to go into essay perspective, good that you reminded essay perspective. See, cultural disaster and all those things, social disaster, this is something I am not able to understand what you are trying to say, because it might be something very controversial, and we must not go into controversial things. But regarding essay, let me say, what about the disaster that is going inside me? This is not something but GS, this is why I say. What about the disaster that is going inside me? What we define disaster? It disrupts the functioning of the society, it leads to loss, and it is not in my capacity to handle that. For example, I am suffering from a breakup. It has disrupted my life. I am no more working. I am thinking of something else, like a mental health issue. Then another thing, it is leading to loss. Yes, definitely it is leading to my loss, because I am losing my mental health, my mental balance, and all those things. And is it within my capacity to cope? No, it is not in my capacity to cope. So this is something that you can explore in an essay. Like how do you help with the disaster that is happening inside me? And that also happens. Everyone, many of us would have faced it. And I always request that if you see someone who is facing some mental challenges, please try to help them, because it is not less than any disaster. And it is always our earnest duty that we must help them in all the way and means possible. So this is all that I wanted to discuss about disaster. I feel you would have got the direction, how do you deal with the disaster, and how do you deal with all those things. So wherever possible in the answers, please write as per NDMA guidelines, as per UN definition, as per Sendai Framework, as per Yoga Framework, and make the answer very objective. And that's all what I wanted to say. It leads to loss. Yes, lives in economy, definitely. So this is what all I wanted to say. And in fact, I cannot discuss all the disaster, because if you will ask me what is important for this year's mains, I can say cloud burst is one of the things that is there in the market, quote unquote. That is very much relevant in the news. You can try to look into that. And in fact, there are other things like landslides. I feel they have repeated it twice. Although landslides are happening now also, I don't feel that it might be repeated. But U of UPSC is unpredictability. So you never know. So these are all the things. Floods and all these also things have happened. And I will say, while writing the answers, if possible, please try to put examples from Northeast India. Why examples of Northeast India are important? Because they are prone to a lot of disasters, and they don't get the mainframe attention that they should get. So this is something, that's why if you put in perspective of the Northeast in your answers wherever possible, not try to put it mechanically, but like flood and all, these things are happening. We knew in Kaziranga it happened, like forest fire and something. If possible, put the examples of Northeast because it helps to make your answer balanced. Rather than putting everything Delhi in the answer, please try to be balanced. Put some of the South India, put some of the Andaman Nicobar, put some of the Northeast India, and it will help make your answer very balanced. Yes, definitely. Yes, you can try to make us one framework, but I say in every disaster there are something common and there are something unique. For example, take the example of the disaster of flood. In the flood, there are high chances of spreading of epidemic. The diseases, you must be knowing, the cholera and all those things. That's why when flood happens, they put bleaching water in everything. Why? Because during the flood times, everything comes in contact with everything. So that is there. So this cholera things. So these things you cannot put in other disaster. Like in drought, you cannot put that. So there are some unique points in something, and you can make a common framework like involving the local people, awareness, all those things. These are common, like the vulnerability mapping, susceptibility mapping, early dissemination system, evacuation plans. These are common. There are some unique points. Please identify them, and you will make a very wholesome and very good answer. And I will say, please try to make the answers look like you are very compassionate person. How will you do that? By giving special emphasis on the vulnerable people. While writing that evacuation of the people, right? Evacuation of the people, including those of the vulnerables, like women, transgender, something like that, like the disabled, like something. So this is something which will make your answer look very compassionate, and you are a very upward-looking civil servant. So this is something that will help. And everywhere where you get the chance, put NDMA, Sendai Framework, all those related terms. It will make your answer look very objective. Put best practices and try to be as broad as possible while writing. Please use NDMA guidelines and all those things, and it will make your answer very good. Please use maps. Please try to use your presence of mind. If there is anything you have seen, if there is any specific thing that your state has done, like for Bihar and all those things, there are many things that they might have done during the COVID. Like for Uttar Pradesh also, we saw a flood last year, if I'm not wrong. So in Assam also, the Kaziranga and all. If there is any specific thing that you've seen, don't hesitate to write. Because at the end, you are going to be an administrator. And if you are seeing some administrative interventions now, please feel free to write. So that's all that I wanted to discuss about disaster. There might be a lot more thing which I might not have discussed. So you can read that, and you must write very good answers. Because again, I am trying to say, this is only to tell you how to read and what to read. And you can read much more than that, and you can use them in your answers, definitely. And due to time constraints, we cannot discuss everything over here. So that's all what I wanted to discuss. If you have any other queries related to anything, you can please write over here, and after that we will end. We have 1 to 2 minutes. Okay. Sir, can you please explain monsoon related questions? Okay. Indian monsoon. As told yesterday about answer writing, I figured out that my thinking was slow, and I've started. Perfect, Sankadeep, perfect. So regarding monsoon, see, for monsoon what happens? In Odia there is a beautiful term that says Jala Bohule Srushtinasa, Jala Bihune Srushtinasa. That means excess of water will lead to destruction of the world, and very less amount of water will also lead to destruction of the world. So what happens in monsoon, now the monsoon has become very vagaries, means you cannot predict the monsoon as such. So what happens? Sometimes it will burst like anything, like in Mumbai you would have seen, and for the rest of the years it is very this thing. It doesn't burst. It doesn't happen. So what are all the risks happening with that? Number one, if there is high monsoon, this thing, you will feel urban poverty will happen. Urban poverty, I'm saying, urban flooding will happen. Flood risk to other parts are also there. Landslides will happen. Why? The Western Ghat landslides are mostly due to construction activities and all, but due to heavy rain, the soil particles will get loose and they will use the water as lubricating agent. The whole of the land mass will fall. So this is something that will happen. Then there might be contamination and all those things. There might be reptiles that will come. So all these things are there in monsoon. So this is a lot of things. So you can try to do that, because anything that is related to, you can put whole of the challenges of the flood over here. So something like that you can do. So that's it. So is there anything else that you want to ask regarding anything, not only with respect to disaster? And if you want, if there is any specific topic that you want me to discuss tomorrow, because we discussed one topic from GS1, we started with, what was the first thing that we, poverty. GS2 we discussed with the criminal justice system reform. Today we had disaster management. Tomorrow, is there anything else that you want? Okay, theories of monsoon. See, that is a standard textbook thing. You can do that. You can do that. That I have to refer, because what you are trying to say, I will look into that, because this is mostly a theoretical thing. I'll refer, and if I find something, I'll tell you theories of monsoon. Basically, that is again. See, UPSC will never ask you what is the theories of monsoon. That is not so mainstream. Okay, so please try to see the previous question, and what are all the important areas. How to cover second ARC. See, second ARC is one of the most jugadu thing. Why jugadu thing? This is something which has recommendation about almost everything. So number one thing that you can do, there are very compilations, various compilations from very different coaching institutes. You can refer to that. In fact, I had seen one of the, you might be knowing about, we have Mudit Jain sir, IRS. In fact, he in his blog has put some 5 to 7 pages of second ARC report. That is also fine. In fact, more than that, I feel that whatever answers you read, and if you feel some second ARC recommendations, please note it down in your notebook. Please make a separate section on second ARC. Please note it down, because second ARC reading as such is like a book again. So you don't know how much to use it. So that's what you can do. Please see where all they have been used. Please compile and use them. That's fine. Because in fact, you will ask me, I also don't use second ARC so much, but I remember certain things. Like for second ARC, RTI is the master key of governance. This is something that is there in second ARC. So after learning a lot of things, so this is something I have memorized. So similarly, there are a lot of other things that I have memorized. So the more you spend time with something, the more you will remember. Yeah. Is there anything else that you want to discuss? I feel, okay, how to go on from generic to specific, which is the review that I'm see again. What makes an answer generic and what makes it specific is example, is substantiating. For example, let us discuss one of the things that we discussed now, like the flood. And the flood has happened, what you will do and all those things. You will write that I will do this, do that, and all those things. No one wants your opinion. Who are you? Who am I to tell? We are all small kids. But if you will write as per NDMA guidelines, these all things are there. It makes the answer very specific. So this is something that I wanted to say. There is another thing that makes the answer very specific, like we have discussed, that there are some unique points of disasters. For each disaster, there are some unique points. If you mention those unique points, like for example, I said, for the chemical disaster, for the biological disaster, for the radiation disasters, you can write that please cover the food and water items. This is something that makes your answer very, particular. Like for example, if you are writing about a court, Supreme Court, High Court or something, please quote the articles. Please write about some law commission recommendations. Please write about some Supreme Court judgments. This makes the answers very particular. So this is something, again, this is, see, generic is something, if you write something and you don't make examples out of it. For example, you say that like how to make the farming as a remunerative occupation. You just write that making irrigation facilities available to them. There you can write e.g. Pradhan Mantri Krishi Sinchai Yojana. This makes your answers very particular. So this is something that you can do. Is it important to read Niti Aayog 3 years aage ka okay recommendation Yojana? See, basically, if you are able to take some 1 or 2 points, that's fine. But if it is taking a lot of your time, I don't feel, because at the end it's ROI. I have said anything that you remember that is more than writing 3 to 4 pages, it is a misutilization of your brain, because there are a lot of stuff to remember. So please prioritize. If you are getting good points, if you read somewhere, please note it down in your notebooks. And if you got the book and something, if you find 1 or 2 very good points that is taking very less time, please do it. If not, then don't be in the guilt that I didn't do that, because I had not done that in the previous attempts. So that's it. If you get, that is very good, because more the knowledge, more is the answer and good. So that's it. And in fact, there are a lot of coaching compilations. You can try to look into that. That's it. Again, I don't feel that involving yourself into reading 300, 400 pages, I don't feel the ROI. If you have time, you can do that. Is there anything else that you want to discuss? I feel we have answered a lot of questions and we are there. I'll just ask you, do you want me to discuss any specific topic tomorrow? Like yesterday, someone has said disaster management. That's why we did disaster management today. Is there any specific topic that you want me to discuss tomorrow, or I will choose a topic of my own? If there is anything, you can please write it in the comment. I will wait for 15 to 30 seconds, or I will choose it tomorrow and will present it to you. And I will close this. Corruption in public life. See, corruption in public life is not a very big thing. Like, it is not something that I can spend 1 hour. Climatology related. Again, this is a very theoretical thing. Separation of power we can do. Definitely we can do separation of power. I will think about it, separation of power. We will see, basically. Philosophy answer writing. Oh, I'm starting the PYQ discussion because see, a lot of things are going on. So that's why I'm starting. Children and women. See, these are all very generic things. I feel, okay, I will try to find something on my own, and I will try to add all those things like the children and women and corruption in public life and separation of power. I feel we can do that, but I need to do some research in that. I cannot come here directly because this is not something that is there in this thing, but this is a good thing. In fact, I had also thought that I will do PYQ analysis. There are a lot of coaching institutes those who have done. This is not very unique. You can definitely you can do it. You can watch a lot of videos. There is nothing new that I can share with you. So let us discuss what or where all you need conceptual clarity, where I can share something with you. At the end, if there are other resources which are helping, then why are we spending time? Okay. Current affairs strategy. See, again something that I will say over here. Current affairs strategy is important if you will realize the value of previous year questions. For previous year questions, please try to analyze. I don't know if you are asking for prelims or mains, but I will say the federal polity will do. Definitely will do. But for current affairs analysis, there is one thing that is coming, mains 365. Okay, Indian economy. We will do that maybe after a few days. Current affairs, mains 365 is there. And in the mains 365, you can find a lot of content. But I will say, please try to do them, please try to do them as in, please go to the previous questions, see what all themes are important. Many times we stick to very small topics and we think that UPSC will ask them, but UPSC never asks, as far as I know, as I feel, from very limited topic that doesn't have very high national implications. Many times they mostly focus on very important topics, and we are mostly busy after small topics out of FOMO. So I feel that this is thing. In fact, if you will ask me, you can do it from mains 365. There is another resource that I was referring, that is inclusive IAS. In fact, what he used to do, he used to take all the relevant materials from the mains 365 and very good content, that too at a very affordable rate. Inclusive IAS, all inclusive IAS, and they have their own course running at very affordable rate, and I feel you can try that. It has helped me immensely, that's for sure. So that's what I referred mainly for current affairs, and there are many compilations that get released at free during the mains, and you can refer them. That's fine. So that's all. Anything else? I feel that okay. So, okay. Good night. Take care. The last and most important thing, don't doubt yourself. You are a very good creation of the God, and don't doubt yourself. You will do very good. Definitely, we will cover all these topics. Definitely, you will do very good. Don't doubt yourself. In fact, if you feel, and again, I let me take the opportunity to tell you something. See, basically, what I feel, that many of you try to mail me a lot of things, and in fact, you will be knowing that I am writing mails this time again. So there are very less chance that I can mail you back, because writing and all those things, it takes a lot of effort. So at this point of time, I don't know, because I'm doing the DVA. DVA takes more than an hour. Then I'm doing this session 1 hour and more than 1 hour. Then I'm doing something for philosophy, Mumukshu. It also takes a lot of time. In fact, I'm starting the Sannidhan for philosophy. So after all of these things, I don't feel I have the energy to do a lot of things again. So whatever doubts you have, please try to ask over here, because it is very easier to say rather than writing all those things and all those things. So I feel, and if you have any friend who has any doubt, and in fact they feel betrayed that I have not replied to their mail or something and all those things, please tell them that they can come at last during the last part of the session, and they can ask their doubts over here. I will try to do whatever is possible on my end, and I'm really sorry again with hands joined that I may not be able to answer all the mails, but I truly respect your feelings, and I truly respect you and love you all for all you are, and thank you again for being here. Namaskar. Take care. Good night. Thank you again. Thanks for all the love. Namaste. Bye bye. So, closing the session.